All right. Well, hey, welcome to this Kairos Network webinar. My name is Matt Peoples, and I am so pumped to be joined today by Mac Lake and Chris Flathers. If you guys don't know these guys, these are two incredible guys to get to know. Mac, I met like 8-9 years ago, something like that. We were about 4 years into the church plant. And Mac did a training on this thing called Leadership Pipeline that I'd never heard of before. And I remember sitting down in the training going, this is the thing we've been missing, like the one thing that could change everything. So Mac, thanks for taking a chance to join us here.
Oh man, it's great to be here with you, Matt.
And then Chris, I'm jealous because Chris is planting in Colorado, and Chris actually got to start his church plant with a leadership pipeline in place, which is incredible. So I thought that would actually be a fun place for us to start, because if you're watching this, you're probably maybe pre-launch into a church plant or early years, and you're thinking something like this sounds interesting. Chris, how did you get exposed to leadership pipeline, and what's the difference it started to make in your church?
Yeah, well, thanks for including me today. It did make a big difference. I met Mac, I don't even know how many years ago now, probably 5 or 6. And I was serving at a larger church in Maine at the time. And what we were going through was, hey, we're having this hard, having a trouble developing leaders who develop leaders, and came across Mac in his training. So we went through the leadership pipeline, and it was game changing in that context for us. It solved the kind of the problems we were facing. So when God was calling us to plant what's now Connect Church, one of the first things we did was sit down and think through, okay, what is our leadership structure going to look like? How are we going to disciple people in a biblical lifestyle of leadership, and let that be the growth path for people as they join us in what God's doing here in Colorado.
That's awesome. So what does it look like? Like, how do you launch with a pipeline in place?
Yeah, so we started by launching a couple of community groups. And what we did is we raised up leaders, we apprenticed leaders, and then saw those groups multiply. And now with a couple of groups, we started to build a launch team from those involved in the groups. And then, we started to gather for services, et cetera. But what it was is it gave us kind of like a path for people to grow on, and then for the church to grow on really from the ground up, which was huge because we planted in COVID, which was not the plan, but Leadership Pipeline did give us a plan to keep discipling our people and growing our people. And what's cool is now, seems like we're post-pandemic. We are able to multiply groups again and teams again in a greater way, as we're now serving more people than we have in the past. So yeah, it's helped our people and also helped our church be able to serve our community.
And I heard you use this term a couple times, and Mac, we were doing a training with you, and I think this totally changed the way I saw Leadership Pipeline. I always thought a Leadership Pipeline like this cool business thing that we kind of like cut and paste and like put into the church world. And then I was sitting down with the training with you, and you talked about it as a leadership development plan. And you started sharing the story. In fact, in your book, I believe it's Multiply, you share the story of the disciples and how Jesus had a very intentional leadership development plan. And all of a sudden it clicked for me. It's like, this isn't just business 101. This is really discipleship 101. Could you share a little bit of that heart behind the pipeline and how you see it as that development process?
Yeah, the leadership pipeline, I mean, you can see the structure right behind me. I call this little structure the generic leadership pipeline, where down here people are leading themselves. I think you might even have a graphic of it, Matt.
Yeah.
Where people are leading themselves, and then the next level of leadership is they're leading others, and some of those people are going to flow up and they're going to lead leaders, and some of those are going to flow up and lead a ministry area like children's ministry, student ministry, groups ministry, and then some of those are going to flow up and lead the church. And so what this represents, it represents a discipleship pathway for believers. In most churches, people They get saved. They get excited about relationship with Christ. So they say, what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to serve. I'm going to serve in the church. And so they'll jump on a ministry team and they're leading themselves. And then a small percentage of people in the church go, hey, I want to learn to lead. And so, or we will recruit them to lead. And so typically we just sort of throw them into leadership versus disciple them into leadership. And in most churches, that's sort of where it ends until you become a staff member. And so what the leadership pipeline does, it gives you a progressive pathway for people's spiritual development as leaders. That's the brilliance of this structure. It helps people go beyond just that simple next step of leadership into a much more advanced discipleship relationship in your church.
Well, and I think what I love about the process as you kind of lay it out is it's intentionally organic. So it's not like this kind of machine that you're running people through. It's very much life on life, which I find huge, but it's also being intentional about that. Because I think, and I don't know what you guys think about this, but I think when people serve in a church, they've got a fundamental assumption going, whether or not they express that what I'm doing in this church is going to help me grow in my faith. And so if you throw them on a parking team, even though they're on a parking team, they're sitting here going, somehow this parking team is going to help me grow in my faith. And I think what snapped it together for me in Leadership Pipeline was you can actually turn the parking team into a place to grow in your faith when you're implementing an intentional process like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And Chris referred to it earlier. It's, the church, when we think about leadership development, the church typically thinks in terms of, okay, we're going to train you to turn our ministry widget. But what we need to change our thinking and say, how do we train our people to live a biblical lifestyle of leadership? That's the game changer when you begin to shift your perspective. We have the best leader that ever walked the planet. We are filled with the Holy Spirit, and we have the Holy Word of God, which is the most transformational book you'll ever read, right? Why in the world is the church not raising up the best leaders on the planet? It doesn't make sense. I had a church call me recently, and they have a lady that's going through their leadership training at the leader level, being apprenticed at the leader level. And they called me and they said that she just got a promotion at her work. And she's so excited because the leadership development her church is providing for her is, she said, I'm applying this stuff at work. It's making me a better leader at work. I mean, could you imagine, Matt, somebody coming up to this lady going, you're a really good leader. Where'd you learn to lead? My church. That's the way it should be. That should be commonplace.
Right? I mean, really, we should have the healthiest organizations around, and we should be leading the way in leadership. I mean, bottom line.
Chris, you got a story about a guy that you discipled whose work noticed the change in his leadership.
Yeah. So that first fall 2019, we have 2 community groups going, and I'm apprenticing a couple of guys to lead new groups. And one of the guys' name is Alex. So we're grabbing lunch, breakfast, coffee, every couple of weeks or so. We're working through some content, talking about what it looks like to lead like Jesus in the church, at work, in the community, at home. And we go through this training module on how to lead a meeting that engages people. So we go through this module, and then later that day, he leads a meeting for the first time at work and just tried to implement what we talked about, what we learned from scripture, what we learned from one another. And the next time we get back together, we're having coffee, and he says, you would not believe what happened. He said, I led this meeting, and after the meeting, my boss came up to me and said, that's the best meeting we've ever had at our company. You need to lead more meetings for us. I no longer had to convince Alex that our time together was valuable. He's in. He's all in. And he has been ever since. And he's leading a group, and it's a good deal. But far beyond that, he's leading his family better. He's leading in his workplace better. And that's a big kingdom win.
Well, and I think too, you make an impact in him and his work, and now he's more receptive to hearing about, the whole of his life, because, oh man, look at what Jesus did at my work. Okay, how's this going to apply to my marriage? How's it going to apply to my neighbor? How's it going to apply in every area. And I think sometimes we shy away from it because we're like, oh, okay, well, what could I give to somebody in the workplace? I think number one, if you're leading a nonprofit ministry, you're already a special kind of leader because you're not leading people that are paid. You're leading people that are giving their time. And that's a whole different animal. So I think that's huge. Now, Mac, you've been doing this a long time. You've worked with existing churches that have established this. What's the difference between building this into the DNA of the church where it starts, and how could a church that's trying to build everything from the ground up put this into place?
Yeah, great question. It's funny because when I work with existing churches, most of the time they come back to me and go, why didn't somebody teach me this 20 years ago before I started the church? The nice thing about pre-launch church planters and the leadership pipeline is you get to build your structure before you even have one person. It's easy to put together a leadership pipeline structure. We did this with my church plant. Matt, if you show, just as one example, show that defining levels worksheet.
Yeah.
This is something that I put together before I ever launched my church. And I put my launch team put this together. But as you see, there were 5 levels in the leadership pipeline of a pre-launch church. Now, we didn't need all 5 levels, but we went ahead and projected out 5 levels because we wanted to build a structure for where we were headed, not where we were at. When we built this, we had like 12 people in a core group, but what we did is we identified all the ministries we were going to start with, and we identified what positions are going to be under each of those ministries and what levels are those positions. And so we had, basic team members, we had leaders across every ministry, we had coaches. We didn't have those people, but we knew to put the positions in so that we could work towards that. And then we knew we would have ministry directors and then the senior leadership. So that's thank you, Matt, for sharing that.
And I think too, I wanted to ask you, this represents the whole of your ministry. And so you've got the same levels in every area of ministry.
Correct.
What's kind of the thinking behind that?
Yeah, you want every ministry to have the same development pathway. If, let's say that in student ministry that you had, some leaders, and then the next level is you, well, once you get 5 or 6 leaders, now those 5 or 6 people are reporting to you. That's fine. You can handle that as a student pastor. Yeah. But what if you put 2 coaches in place? Now you're teaching 2 people on your team to lead at a higher level. Now, if for some reason you lost your student pastor, a year or 2 later, and it's a volunteer student director, most likely, but if you lost that individual, the 2 people that are coaches are the most likely people that could step up and take that individual's place. Even if they don't take their place, they've led at a higher level in that ministry so that they can at least cover the bases until someone is put in that director position. So it creates the same development pathway for every ministry.
That's huge. And then you're not pulling somebody in and trying to teach them the DNA of your culture while also trying to teach them the ministry role they're in, and trying not to have anything kind of drop in the process. So it creates this system where you can kind of interchange, which I think is really cool. Yeah. Now, a lot of times you see like a leadership pipeline and you think this is for a church 2 or 3 times my size. So not only why would I try and start with this with the million other things I'm trying to do while I start a church, because literally you feel like you're doing a million things when you're starting a church. But not only why wouldn't I do this when I start, but why wouldn't I just wait till we were 200 or 300 people in attendance and then implement the pipeline?
Yeah, I'll speak to that. Yeah, you have a ton to do as a church planner. Pre-launch, launch, post-launch, there's plenty for you to do. And I think central to what we're called to in pastoral ministry is equipping the saints for the work of ministry. And that's really what this is getting us, it's a tool to accomplish that purpose. So one, it's central to our calling in church leadership. And two, if you want to grow to be a church of 200 to 300, you got to figure out a system of care so that you can really care for each person. Not every single person needs to be cared for by you, as hard as that might be to hear, but it's true. Like we aren't the hero here. Jesus is, but everyone does need someone who cares. And this leadership pipeline creates a structure, a system where everyone can be cared for and discipled. So it's paramount to our calling. It's practically needed. And as you multiply your influence through the influence of others, you're going to be able to do what you're best at. And that's going to be good for the church. It's going to be good for the kingdom. But if you're stretched so thin, if I'm stretched so thin, it's not going to be good for the church. It's not going to be good for the people we're leading. And we're probably going to shrink to the size of our span of care. So I think it's very, very important. And the advantage of starting with something like this pre-launch is that it's now plug and play. Like you can just run the playbook instead of having to scramble and reshape your culture down the road, which is a lot more work than forming a culture from the ground up, at least when it comes to something like this.
I think that's huge.
This is why I recommend when you get a launch team together, even if it's 4 to 5 people, part of what you want to do with those people is leadership development so that it's building it, just like Chris said, it builds it into the DNA of your church right away. So that's another reason it's so important to do this pre-launch, because you're building in that DNA of leadership development, or what I like to call discipling of leaders. When surveys have been done, even Lifeway did a research this past year, it's showing the number one challenge that churches are facing is leadership development. So as a pre-launch church planter, why not, cut that off at the pass and build it in from day one?
Yeah. And I think, here's the other thing that's really important. You may be watching this, you may be early years of plant, pre-plant, and you're thinking, yeah, this is great, but this is one more thing to add. I want to point out something. There's 3 of us here on the webinar. All 3 of us have planted churches. Only one of us is still at the church we planted, which means we left and went on to new calls and new callings that God had for us. And if you want that church to thrive when you leave, I'm so glad that 4 years in, we encountered what Mac was teaching, because that gave us 3 years to be able to implement some of these principles, to be able to really start thinking about training leaders and training some of those leaders up. Because at year 7, I took a call and took on another church and launched out a church planting organization. And because we had such a strong group of leaders left, they were actually able to transition for 6 months without a pastor. Watching videos, the attendance did not dip much. The outreach was strong in the community because we had leaders that were there who knew what they were doing and took ownership of the ministry. And so I think that for me is the biggest reason I'm like, we got to get this out there. We got to let people know, because this might not be your forever calling. And if you're planting a church, there's probably a little bit in your wiring that doesn't make it a forever calling, because right about the time it's, up and to the right and the books are where they need to be and you could just start coasting for a few years. You're like, something in my spirit says I'm on to the next thing. Yeah. So one of the reasons we did this is during COVID, not only did Chris launch a church, but Mac, you started doing a lot more virtual cohorting. And I think the results have been pretty impressive with what you all have been doing as far as implementing that. And you actually have an opportunity for people to jump into a pre-launch cohort to be able to work with a group of other people that are pre-launch and build out a leadership pipeline. So could you talk to us about what that looks like and what somebody could expect if they stepped into any one of the virtual cohorts?
Yeah, prior to 2020, I worked primarily with very, very large churches, because for me to deliver it, I had to go on site. And for me to go on site 4 or 5 times over a year took it's expensive. So during COVID, I created a leadership pipeline e-course. And the whole intent was to, how can I package this in such a way that the normal size church can actually experience it at an affordable price? And so put the course together thinking, I hope this works, you know? And so we had a few churches hear about it and they signed up, and I would do one-on-one. So they would do the e-course, they would do part 1, then I do 2-hour coaching. They do part 2, 2-hour coaching. And over a few months, I would just walk them through it and help them build out their leadership pipeline. Well, I was floored. I thought, wow, I don't have to be on site to deliver this. This is great. But then we took it to the next level. We said, okay, not only will we work with a church one-on-one through the e-course, let's try a collab. So we put a collab together, which was a group of about 10 churches, and each of them received the e-course, and it was the same rhythm. Watch the course, do the 2-hour coaching. And it was working. And I was like, wow, we're helping. Now we're able to help a lot of churches at a much more affordable price. And so it's been really fun to watch that. Well, recently, I would say over the past 4 or 5 months, in some of my trainings, I've had 5 different pre-launch planters, and each of them came to me separately, went, wow, I'm so thankful I got this now. And what I recognized is in the trainings, they sat there pretty quiet. And the other churches are asking a lot of questions. Well, they're not asking a lot of questions. One, they feel guilty. Because, well, I don't have any people, so I can't really ask, or I don't have many people, so I can't ask questions yet. And then a lot of times they couldn't do the exercises because they don't have people to do the exercises. So all 5 of these guys came to me separately and went, this is phenomenal. I love this. Thank you. I thought, oh my gosh, I need to put something together for planters who have not started yet. So in early May, we're going to kick off a leadership pipeline intensive. Normally it lasts about 8 months. This is going to be 12 weeks. It's going to be 12 weeks because you don't need 8 months to build this out. So we're going to meet for 12 weeks. You get the e-course, do the 6 2-hour coaching sessions, and we're just going to make our way through it and help you build out the framework. And everything's going to have a template. So a lot of it, you just have to fill in the template and you're ready to roll with the leadership pipeline. We're going to try to really make it easy for the planter.
Yeah. And I think, it's kind of funny. That is no exaggeration. The e-course is incredible because I've actually had the opportunity. I've gone through that cohort style in person, live with Mac once a month. We're driving from Knoxville, Tennessee down to Atlanta, bringing the team down. I mean, that was a blast. That was our first experience with it. But when I came up here to New Jersey, we brought together a group of churches and we launched out one of these leadership cohorts. And it was right after the course, I think was just finishing up. So you launched it out to us, got to walk through it through the course. And I found that so tremendously beneficial because not only could you walk through the course and then do sessions, live with a couple coaches, connect with other churches. But on top of that, if you needed to go back and look at some principles again, or just take some more time sitting in something, you could easily do that because you had the course right there, being able to walk through those principles. And I found that on a few of the items, I was like, I don't feel like I know this concept as well. So I jump back and I check out the course a little more. And it was tremendously beneficial in pulling together some of our pipeline stuff.
Yeah, Matt, I was just working a couple weeks ago. Well, right now I'm working with a church in Kansas City, church plant, and they were struggling with a couple of the concepts. So what we did is we said, hey, why don't you rewatch those videos and then let's talk about it again and let's apply it a little bit more personally. And it was game changing, but you couldn't do that. It's not like, I'm going to represent all the same content again. They can just rewatch the video and get brought back up to speed. And they found it incredibly helpful too.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And I think even if you want to bring more people through it, because the way that you deploy this is a little bit different. You can't just go online and buy the online course, right? You have to do that in community with somebody. What's kind of the thinking behind that, Mac?
Yeah, the course gives you all the information. The book gives you all the information, but there's only so much you can cover in that content. Everybody has a unique context. Everybody has unique personality or bent. And so the coaching allows the church and the team, because you can invite your entire team, into the coaching, it allows you the opportunity to say, okay, we're different. So how can we do this? Or how does this apply to us? And I tell people, I've been doing this for years now. By this point, I've seen everything. I've seen everything. And so, it allows me to speak in a very customized way. Or one of our trainers. I mean, both of you guys are one of our navigators, and we have others. It allows our navigators to speak into that church in a very customized way. And I literally have had people get on a phone call or on the Zoom call, the coaching call, and go, "We're just stuck. We're stuck. We're not sure." And they're wrestling, and they've been wrestling for a week over this. I said, "Oh, no. Let me show you how this works for you." And just little turn of a button, and boom, they're freed up and they're excited and they're going, "Oh, we couldn't see that." And so that's where the coaching really, really helps.
Yeah. And I think, me personally, I love figuring stuff out. I'll pick up the book, I'll pick up the YouTube video, figure out how to do it and start applying it myself. But I found there's just certain moments where an outside set of eyes makes a world of difference. If you're doing any kind of structural development or any kind of visioning process, it's really hard when you're in the organization 24/7 to be able to see it clearly. I remember, being vision process certified, and our church was going through it, and I still had somebody from the outside come in because I knew after a certain point, you don't see the ugly couch anymore, like Andy Stanley says.
Yeah.
And so having somebody else that can look and see that thing you couldn't see on your own makes just a world of difference.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think there's also the element of the collab is you get the community of other, in this case, pre-launch planters. And having been in this process for 3-ish years now, planting a church is lonely. There are networks, and that's helpful and that's needed. But who do you resonate with? Who are you connecting with and can share best practices? Around leadership development, but also build a relationship potentially that could lead to conversations beyond that. So I wish I had this a pre-launch collab kind of thing when we were going into it. I was familiar with the content, had seen it fleshed out in an established context, but the community of working that through together is really key too.
Now, I wanted to jump into this because I really want to jump into some leadership nuts and bolts as well. So you said normally it takes about 8 months to walk through this process with an established church. You said a big difference with a church plant is the timeline is just much shorter. What makes the timeline shorter? And then what are some of the other big differences that you notice between established church trying to implement this versus church plant implementing it from the ground up?
Yeah. Number one, you don't have to change anything. There's nothing to change. There's no battle to fight, it's just, this is our structure. So I planted in 1997 and I put together a structure, system, processes, all that sort of thing before we launched. We literally had a notebook. I found it recently. It was so cool. I found it in an old closet or something. And I found it recently and I went back through it and it had our processes, our job descriptions, our roles, just all that stuff. And I was like, wow, this is really cool to see this. Now we put all that together before we launched our church. There's another guy that planted in town the same time I did. And he didn't put any of that together. He threw a group of people together and just started doing church, right? And, we took 9 to 12 months, put our processes and systems together. When we started our church and people started coming in from other churches as well as unbelievers, and they would see everything in writing, they never tried to change anything because it was written down and they would see it. But that poor guy, I'd get together with lunch. He'd go, "Oh, my people are driving me crazy. They're wanting to start this and they're wanting to change this." This was a year in, So that's the beautiful thing as church plant. You don't have to change anything. Secondly, your people as a church plant, your people are extremely teachable. Typically, your leaders are teachable. They're moldable. They're expecting change. They're expecting to do something different. And so you can begin to mold that DNA so easily in that phase. When I work with existing churches, not only do they have things they have to change and undo and unlearn, a lot of times what happens is they have key leaders or staff members who've been in a position for a long time, and they've never done leadership development the way we're talking about it, a relational discipleship approach. And they struggle with it, Matt. I can't believe it. Literally watching seminary trained full-time staff people who look me in the eye and go, all right, I haven't executed this because I've never discipled a leader before, and I just don't know that I can. And I'm scared to try. And so
I think that last point right there, if you went through a training like this for no other reason, that right there will be game changer in your ministry. Because after walking through this process with Mac, I not only walked through it for our church, but it changed the way I approached church plant training with the trainees that I had. It gave us the confidence to launch summer internships and know that we would have something valuable to give. It even changed the way we built out the Kairos Network church plant training pipeline. I mean, everything we have done, we boil it down to those simple principles and are able to build that into a system because of the stuff that we learned doing leadership pipeline. And so it became a game changer ministry-wise for us in how we're able to just disciple people.
Absolutely.
So what are the top mistakes somebody would make in trying to implement a leadership pipeline?
Chris, you want to throw a couple out, and I will too.
I would say one of the biggest is assuming it's just going to happen organically. Like it's just going to happen, you know? You don't have to put much thought into it, little to no intentionality. You know, we'll just find people who have leadership and we'll just place them in a position and all systems go. And you know what? That works for a time. And then people get burned out and there's more turnover than is needed. And people aren't growing in their roles. They're just turning that ministry widget like Mac described at the front end. So I think that's one of the mistakes, is assuming this doesn't need my time, attention, and energy. It'll just happen. Yeah. Or it's just not my role. But we kind of addressed that earlier. It very much is your role if you're in church leadership.
Yeah. Matt, I would add a couple of things. One is not modeling it. And that's why I'm excited about this pre-launch planter training, because I can teach these guys, how do you model leadership development from day one? How do you make it a part of you? Leadership development is not something you do, it's something you are. Disciple making is not something I do, it's something I am. It's something flows out of you, it flows out of who you are. Well, discipling leaders should be the same way. And so we need to model it. If we're not modeling it, we can't expect it. And so you're not modeling it, it's a mistake. A second mistake, I would say, is not measuring it or not keeping our eye on the ball. Matt, every pastor watching this gets a budget report in their inbox every single month. How much money came in? How much money went out? Where are we at? If you don't do that, you're in trouble, But how often are we getting a people report on our desk? How many people are in our pipeline? Who's at what level of our pipeline? And so this is one of the things I teach. If you don't do anything else, at least look at the people in your pipeline once a quarter, because your people asset is much greater than your financial asset. And so if we keep that close an eye on our finances, why are we not keeping that close an eye on our people? Because that's a better asset. You can get more done.
I think that's
you don't get done with money.
Well, and I think that's a huge point, Mac, because you've got a few of those key phrases. Like, I just want a book one day of like Mac Lake's like key phrases, because they're game changing. But one of them that was probably the most game changing for me is when you said, you don't need people for tasks, you need tasks for people, because it just changes the way you see that. You need a people report and you need tasks so that you can develop people to look more like Jesus in their everyday life. And when you've got opportunities at your church for places for people to serve, there's a reason you see more men get involved at a portable church plant than you do in an established church. It's because there's a lot of hauling and lifting and all that fun stuff that a guy's like, I can't hold somebody's hand and pray, but I can lift that speaker for you if you want me to. And it becomes huge opportunities for people to just grow in their faith. And so I think, thinking through how you get a people report is great. Speaking of that, you all have seen this a ton. What are some of the best ways people can track that when they're looking at their people and who's involved in what?
Well, I'll share a story to illustrate what you just said, Matt, and then I can answer your question. That idea of like, you need tasks for people to then continue to grow in their discipleship. So when we set out to plant, we had a launch large approach, that was the playbook we were playing. And then COVID hit, and that's like so culturally irrelevant. We didn't even talk about it because it just wasn't sensitive to the moment that we were in. Really as a world. So we ended up punting our launch date back. We thought it was going to be September 2020. And we were like, no, we're going to put it back to 2021. We don't know when this thing's going to clear up, et cetera. But then in September, we said, you know what? We need services so that our people have a place to serve. Like, we just need to give people an opportunity to own the mission, to use their gifts, to be the church. And that's why we launched. We actually launched services to give our people an opportunity to own the mission, to use their gifts, and to build up the church. And that wasn't what we initially pictured, but we have seen an incredibly high level of engagement throughout since we launched in person in November of 2020. And I think it's in part because of why we launched, and it being hey, we want this to be an opportunity for you to have ownership and be a part. So that having a context for people to use their gifts is really key. When it comes to your question about what does this look like? We talk about like a team picture when we go through leadership pipeline with churches, where you get a snapshot, kind of like picture like a roster. Like if you're a coach of a sports team, like you have a roster. It's like, okay, how many team members do we have? How many leaders do we have? How many coaches, et cetera? And all to ensure, like, do we have a healthy span of care? Like, are the ratios healthy? And that's a really helpful thing, because then you can be like, oh, you know what? Like, we've got a ton of team members right now, but it seems like we need some more leaders because our team members or our group members are not being cared for well. Well, who could we pour a little extra into? Who could we apprentice who's currently a team member who we could invite to be a leader? So then it's not just like, names on a sheet of paper. They really are faces and stories and people, because we're now then saying, hey, here's what I see in you, Joe. Have you ever thought about leading a group, or ever thought about leading the connections team, et cetera? And then you get to see the discipleship take on a whole new shape.
Matt, I'll give you the ideal, and I'll give you an extreme in the answer to that. The ideal is you take your church management system and you tag people, team member, leader, coach, director, and now they're tagged, and boom, you can just pull up, what you want to see. That would be the ideal. Wow. The second would be a spreadsheet, sort of like what Chris is mentioning, just spreadsheet, sort of like that document we showed a while ago. Just put people's names in at those different levels. But I was on site recently with a church I worked with 3 years ago, and walked back in their office, and they have a wall in their office. I mean, the wall is, I'd seen a picture of it. I'd never seen it in person before. The wall is, 10 foot high and probably 24 feet long. And it's a chalkboard wall, and their entire leadership pipeline. Every name. This is a church of 1,000 people. Every name under every ministry, who's serving at what level. They had circled all of the people who were discipling other leaders. They had arrows up by people who had potential to move the next level. And he was showing me all this. I was blown away. When he was showing me this, a young man walked around the corner. I think he's 24 years old. He said, come over here. And he introduces me to this young man. He said, This young man's been coming to our church since, he was a teenager. He went to college here locally, felt a call to ministry. And over the past 3 years, we've been working him through our leadership pipeline. We just hired him as our student pastor. This kid had been trained as a leader, been trained as a coach, and now they trained him at the director level, and boom, he's their student director.
Well, and I think you just nailed with that story. One of the biggest reasons to implement something like this is because, COVID, everybody wants to talk about COVID as being the thing that changed everything, but really it's just a catalyst. And it kind of, took us 10, 20 years into the future to where numbers were already trending. And so many denominations, so many church bodies are seeing a decline in their numbers. And that also means then at the professional ministry level, they're seeing a decline. And I can't tell you how many churches, especially smaller churches I've walked in, they're like, hey, can you help us? What's our next step? I walk in, there's obviously no leadership development stuff going on there. Their number one goal, whether they can afford it or not, is we just need to get a pastor. That'll change everything. But people don't realize at the seminary level, there's less and less people that are going into ministry, which means there are less and less people to reach out to for ministry. I'll use the Lutheran Church as an example because that's my denomination. In the next 10 years, our clergy body will be cut in half. Like we will have half as many pastors in a 10-year period than we do today. And our seminary system, even though we have 2 seminaries, is not refilling that gap. So what that means is this: you got about 500 vacant churches, you'll move to at least 1,000. And so if you're only relying on grabbing leaders from outside to fill those gaps, you're going to find there are less and less leaders to grab. But if you put in a process in which you can raise leaders up from within, you'll have people that never thought of themselves as ministry leaders or church leaders, that all of a sudden they get into it and they start serving in a natural step, step-by-step progression. And all of a sudden you'll have the leaders you need in your ministry, and you'll have so many leaders, you'll be sending them out other places, which is really cool.
Yeah. I have networks, denominations call me on occasion because I do a lot of work with church planting, and say, hey, do you have any church planters in such and such city? And potential church planters, we want to plant a church in that city. Do you have anybody? And I was like, well, don't you have any churches there? Yeah, we do, but we just don't have any potential church planters. And everybody's looking for church planters, but nobody's trying to take the time to develop them. And so what I share with them is, listen, we say we have a church planting problem because of the lack of church planters. We don't have a church planting problem. We have a discipleship problem. The root of the problem is a discipleship problem. The fruit of the problem is a lack of church planters or a lack of staff. And so the solution really is to get back to, how did Jesus develop his 12? He discipled them as leaders. And so we got to, we do it. The church does a decent job discipling people to follow Jesus and live like Jesus. We gotta disciple people to lead like Jesus.
That's huge. And I think, there's a lot of talk now about multiplication and seeing multiplying movements. Outreach, we now have the top 100 multiplying churches list, which I think is incredible that we've got that going. But if you want to be about multiplication, this is the place to start. Because if you want to be a church that multiplies other churches, build it into your strategy from the beginning. Because this is not just about having a leadership pipeline for your kids' ministry. This is about the leadership pipeline that could lead to more churches being planted. And that's huge.
Yeah, absolutely.
Man, I tell you what, if you all are interested, we're going to be sending out a resource with this. You'll grab it. But check out, if you're interested in doing one of the cohorts, the multiplyinggroup.org /leadership pipeline. We've got it in the chat here. You can click on that. We'll send it out in the follow-up resource. And then also, if you're interested, anybody on this call could help you out. If you're a church plant that is wanting to build this into place, man, you need to talk to Mac or Chris. Chris has done this with several church plants, not just his own, and helped them kind of implement this process from the ground up. Mac actually built the Send Networks church plant training pipeline. So he's got a little bit of experience with church plants and building out church plant training pipelines. But you guys definitely need to check out these resources. And the other thing we're going to throw in this resource is Mac and I have had several conversations over the years about everything from, top 3 ways to raise up leaders within your church, to 8 spheres of leadership, things like that. And so we've included all those conversations in this follow-up resource. So you can get a chance to just kind of grow a little bit more in your leadership. And then when you get the opportunity, if you've ever thought about it, I'd say click the link, check it out, because doing leadership pipeline training can be a game changer for your ministry. And if there's any other last encouragements, what would you tell guys as they're getting ready to think about doing this journey?
Yeah. When I ask pastors, what's your leadership development strategy? They always tell me we don't have one, or they'll say ours is organic, which means they don't have one. And here's what I've discovered over the years. When you make leadership development intentional, then you can make it reproducible. When it's reproducible, it's unstoppable. So if you want an unstoppable leadership development approach to see more and better leaders developed in your church at the various levels, then check out the pre-launch church planter cohort. But we also have one for churches under 1,000, and that starts in May as well. So we have 2 different cohorts, existing churches and pre-launch churches. So we have both opportunities, and we'll help you build out that intentional leadership development strategy.
That's huge.
I would just add, as you think of developing leadership in others, who's developing leadership in you? Mm-hmm. And Mac's been one of those people for me. There have been some others who have coached me along the way, but it has been paramount through this planting process that someone is pouring into me and sharing their wisdom with me as I then overflow that and lead the church that God's called us to lead. So who's developing you as you're developing others?
That's good.
Yeah, that's huge. Well, man, Mac, Chris, I want to thank you guys so much for taking time with everybody today. If you're watching this, if you want more resources, jump on the kairosnetwork.com. If you want the follow-up resource, it's also on the kairosnetwork.com. You can check that out. And of course, we'll throw out some more webinars. This will not be the last time that you hear from these guys for sure. And definitely check out these pipeline cohorts. They can really be game changer in your ministry. So thanks a bunch, guys, and have a blessed Holy Week.
Thanks, guys.